Hi friends, welcome back to the Infinite Library, and today we're going to get nasty because we're going to talk about my worst books of 2024. These are the books that filled me with loathing, with disappointment, that honestly, yeah, that's the vibe of how I feel about these books. Am I the one screaming or am I the one that wants to kill them? Take your pick. But either way, these are the books that are going to be my worst books of 2024. And not only do I have my 10 worst books of the year, I also have some dishonourable mentions, which didn't quite make it into being my 9 Circles of Hell or my 10 Circles of Hell books, but are definitely up there as being books that just kind of ruined my day. So, without further ado, let's get to it. So, as to be expected, because I don't keep books that I don't like, I don't have very many of these physically, but I do have a couple still floating around, and we're actually going to start off with our dishonourable mentions with one that I still have, only because I haven't managed to get rid of it yet. And that is The Book Eaters by Sonia Dean. This was such a disappointing book for me as well, because on paper, this sounds like it would be totally up my alley. This was actually a buddy read that I did with a friend of mine, and neither of us really liked it. This actually did start off quite promising. I quite liked the start, where we essentially are following a mother who was running away with her son from this like scary clandestine family of people who eat books, because her son is different and he doesn't like to eat books. He likes to eat people's brains. So really fun kind of horror premise. I'd been told this was queer, so I was just expecting a good time dealing with this book, and unfortunately I just didn't like it. This book was really boring. It took ages for anything to happen, and I just didn't care by the end of this book, unfortunately. Like, the queer romance in it was no chemistry, didn't really like the other character anyway, so it just wasn't working for me in that level. And I will say that the only things I did like about this book were all the flashbacks, where we were seeing our main character back in the past and how she grew up within the Book Eater Society, but I basically didn't like anything else about this book, unfortunately. Yeah, this was just a total misfire for me, and just very disappointing, because this is such a cool premise. I love books about books. I love weird horror. I love queer horror, and it just missed the mark in every single way. So definitely not bad enough to be in my top 10, but I felt it was still worth a mention. Next, we actually have 2 manga books, which I read for my 30 and 30 manga challenge. Link up there to that. These were books that I'd gone into with very high expectations, because I just heard really good things about them. They're really popular, and both of them are kind of like dark sci-fi books. And I really didn't like either of them, to be honest. The first book was Gantz, which is a very twisted, messed up series about these like bounty hunters, I think it is. I've already forgotten. I read these back April or May or something, but I really did not like the first book of this series. It was really like sexist in terms of the women, and I just wasn't down for that. There's this whole thing where like this woman turns up naked and they are just gonna rape her, basically. And yeah, it just made me really uncomfortable, really didn't sit well with me, and I don't think it's a series I want to waste my time reading. The other one is Blame. Again, I only read the first volume of this one. This one I just didn't understand. This is another much more futuristic kind of sci-fi. I'd heard good things about it as well, and I just did not know what the hell I was reading. I just couldn't tell what was happening either, because the artwork was so all over the place. It was so dark, it was hard to tell what was going on. We just jumped into a situation, and whilst I don't mind that, I just did not know what on earth was happening. I didn't know who any of the characters were. We were just lore dumped. Didn't work for me. Unfortunately, not a series I'll be continuing. Then we have another 3 books, and these were all books that I DNF'd. I didn't keep anything that was not a DNF in my top 10, but I feel like any 3 of these could have probably ended up in my top 10. So the first book was a big disappointment to me, and that was The Pairing by Casey McQuiston. I went into this book with such high hopes. I really loved the other books by her I'd read previously, which was Red, White and Royal Blue, and this sounded fun. if nothing else. Like, I was a little bit leery about certain part of the premise. We are following these two people. One is non-binary, and the two of them used to be in relationship, but then they split up whilst they were about to go on this like European tour together. So they had to cancel the tour, but they were able to like rebook it again at a certain point in time, and they accidentally both rebooked to be the exact same tour. So they end up basically going on the same thing together on a big coach trip with a bunch of other people, and that was okay. I didn't hate that as a premise. What I did hate as a premise, however, was that they decide that because, oh, we're over each other and we should just be friends, let's have a friendly competition. Both of them decide that they are going to make a competition to see how many people they can sleep with whilst they travel across Europe. And I hated that anyway. But the worst thing was also about how it was executed. It was just very shallow, it kind of felt to me. But not only were they doing this competition with one another where they're trying to one-up each other and pretend they're still friends, they very clearly were not over each other. And it ends up getting really toxic and really like messed up. The first half of this book, like, I DNF'd it at the halfway point, I will say, because I was getting triggered. Because it's very much about them still being in the breakup of their relationship. And I know this is a second chance romance. I know in the second part they're gonna resolve things, they're gonna get together. I know how this is going to end. I know Casey McQuiston's books. And the writing was fine. I will say that. Like, this is again another reason why it's not in my worst books, because the writing was fine. I was liking the writing, I was into it. I was too into it was the issue, that I was getting too emotionally close to the characters. And for me, I've had like bad breakups in the past that are very depressing, and this was just bringing all of that back for me, and I was just really hating it, as well as just not being on board with the whole we're sleeping with everybody in Europe as we go. So I got to the point where basically we end the first character's storyline, which, by the way, really struggled with their character storyline. I found them infuriating. I really didn't like them. And if I'm being honest, like, I didn't mind the other guy so much, who we were switching to his perspective for the second part of the book. And it's possible that I could have carried this on and I would have really liked the book by the end of it, but I was just getting so emotional about this, like in a really bad negative way. I was just not having a good time. And I really just didn't like Theo, I think is their name, the non-binary character who we start off with. I found them to be such a toxic person, and I just did not really want to root for them being in a relationship, because I was just like, after all this they've done to one another, how is this going to be a healthy relationship? I just didn't see it. So yeah, I just got really upset with this book, unfortunately. It really just was not for me. I'm still going to read other books by Casey McQuiston for sure, but I could not finish this book. It just, no, just could not. Another DNF, and one that I actually do have a copy of, because Lord help me, I'm going to try this again at some point, because it is one of my favourite authors of all time. Prince Lestat in the Realms of Atlantis. I love The Interview with the Vampire and Vampire Lestat. I love many books in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series. This is where I'm up to in the series. This is the second to last book in the series. I'm so close to completing this series. By God, this was awful. I probably got maybe 100 or so pages in before realizing that it was a struggle, and I just didn't care. The thing is, don't get me wrong, I love Anne Rice. I love her writing. She writes some of my favorite books. She also writes some of my least favorite books. Unfortunately, she is kind of a hit or miss author for me. Like, when she strikes so well, and when she strikes out, my gosh. This was just kind of silly. Like, the previous book I did manage to finish, which was Prince Lestat, also a really silly book. I really struggled with that one too. I didn't like it. This is following on basically from where that one left off, and it just gets even more silly. Like, we're kind of like, yeah, there's aliens in Atlantis now, and we're also going to focus like 80% of the book not on the main character, but with these other random characters who I don't care about, because they are not all the other really good characters that we've had throughout the rest of the series. They're just random other people that we're supposed to bother about their storyline with. So I am going to be going back to this because I do want to complete this series. I do want to have read all the Vampire Chronicle books, but it was not good. It was not good. It's going to be a struggle. I'm really going to have to push myself to get through this. I obviously still keep it because it's not only signed, it's the only signed book of hers that I have, and you know, she's one of my favourite authors. And I will finish the Vampire Chronicles series because I love it, but not good, not good. And the final book that deserves an honourable mention that I did DNF pretty far in, like 200 pages or so we're saying, is The Bell Witches by Lindsay Kelk. And this was a weird one for me because Lindsay Kelk is primarily a romance author from what I've heard. And this was her first fantasy, I guess it's a romantasy, but it wasn't really marketed that way. It was like marketed as being her first, I want to say YA fantasy. I think it was more YA than it was adult in terms of like a protagonist was like a teenager. And this one was sad because I was genuinely really loving this book. And then the romance happened. And I was like, this is a romance author. She should know how to write this. I have never read anything so bad as the romance in this book. It was so cringy. It was literally just romance by numbers. They were saying exactly the same things that I've heard in so many things before. It was insta-love, which I also hate. It was the most cringy thing I've ever read, which is so disappointing because I loved the fantasy storyline in this book. We're following a girl who, after a tragedy in her family, ends up staying with like this part of her family that she's never met before. Turns out she's from a magical lineage, and they are teaching her how to learn how to use magic. And I loved that storyline. I thought it was so good. I loved the dynamic between our main girl and her family. I loved where it was going. I just wanted that to be the story. And then the romance just kept getting shoehorned in. And I was like, is this what we're getting? Is this what we're getting for the rest of the book? And I did go and check a couple of reviews, and I do believe that we kind of lose the main plot because the romance becomes everything. And I was not here for that, so I was out. So yeah, really, really disappointing. This book has so much potential to be genuinely so good. And I just could not get past the romance. It was just painful. Like, I was listening to it by audiobook. It was painful to listen to. But now, on to worse things, because we're going into my top 10 worst books of the year. Buckle up. Here we go. Okay, taking the number 10 spot, and honestly kind of a weird one for me. I almost feel like this book was not bad enough to really make it in my top 10. And then I think about it more, and I'm like, no. And that is The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. If you don't know, I really love all the books I read by Sarah Waters before. She writes some really great historical fiction. A lot of it is very queer as well. She wrote Fingersmith, she wrote Tipping the Velvet, she wrote Affinity. Love all of those. This was another book by hers that I'd got in a charity shop, and I was like, I'll love it because it's Sarah Waters. I hated this book. This was not queer as well, by the way. May have been the issue, but also I feel like even if the characters had both been women, I'd have still hated it. This was, I guess, kind of marketed as being a gothic literary story mystery or something. I don't know what it was supposed to be honest. But this was a case of I hate the main character so much. Basically, this is about this guy who I think is a doctor or something, and he ends up getting involved in this. They're kind of like a noble family, but fallen from grace. Like, they're not rich. They're like struggling for money, that kind of thing. And he ends up going and getting involved in their family. I think it's like a mother, their daughter, and possibly a brother who, yeah, there's a brother because that's how he gets into it, because the brother has an injury and he helps him and then like is doing physiotherapy with him or something. But he gets obsessed with the girl, who is probably 10 years younger than him, I want to say. She's kind of like depicted as, for that time period, I think this is like 1940s, I want to say. She's kind of depicted as being like I'm not like other girls, because she's like smart and she is kind of taking over the running of the place, which is not a girl's job to do. And he like kind of falls for her, and it is the most awkward thing I've ever seen. He gave such father vibes, which I hated. And then he starts like just not listening to her, and he starts planning out her life and just assuming she's agreeing. And it was just horrible. I hated the behaviour from the main character, and it dragged for so long as well. Like, it all kind of ended up being very messy, like tragic, I guess, towards the end, but I didn't care by that point because I hated the protagonist so much. And if you have a book that makes me hate the main character, you've lost me. So yeah, that was just a big disappointment. I'll still read more by Sarah Waters, but I really did not like that book. It was not for me. At number 9, we actually have a reread, which I debated concluding it, but it's been so long since I originally read it that it kind of felt like it was a totally new book to me. And that was the 4th and I guess final-ish book in the Girls series by Jacqueline Wilson. So because Jacqueline Wilson had a new book coming out this year, which was her first adult book, which was actually following on as like a sequel to the Girls series, following on to see what these characters were doing 25 years later, basically. I reread a lot of her books for a video, link here, and as part of that, I obviously reread the whole of the Girls series, which was 4 books, and I do remember back when I was younger liking these books a lot, also finding them kind of icky, and my god did the ickiness really come out in a reread. I still fairly liked the first 2 books. I think in the series, the 3rd book was not great and the final book was awful. And honestly, so much of that is to do with the main love interest, who is called Russell. I hate him. He is such a chauvinistic dickhead. I'm so glad that we kind of got that in the sequel, that Jacqueline was like, yeah, no, I made a mistake when I made him the main love interest. Yeah, this book was just so bad for me. This book honestly kind of ruined the series for me a little bit. Like in this book, I'm not really going to go into spoilers because this is a final book in a series, but basically our main characters are 3 teen girls. They're going through stuff, and in that book, it's just very depressing. There's a whole storyline where basically her love interest kind of steals her artwork idea for a competition, and then she kind of has to make her own thing, and she gets inspired by like some childhood stories that her mother made for her to make her own thing. And everyone is so horrible to her about it. And they're basically like, oh, you're just stealing from your mother. And she's like, no, I'm making my own. And they're horrible to her. There's this whole like chauvinistic through line throughout the whole book, I think. There's also a whole thing where there's a cheating thing that happens, which I think is really stupid, and I think that gets resolved really stupidly. Yeah, it was just a really bad book, and no, you can see more of my thoughts in the video because I'm just going to start ranting about it now because it just makes me angry. Okay, the next book, number 8. This was me trying out a book by an author who I know I've previously loved, and now I'm afraid I'm going to hate all her books when I finally get around to rereading them. If Gavin Says It All is correct, judging by what I gather from his videos, they're not good. But this is by LJ Smith. This is the start of a series that I never read when I was younger. I read some of the Vampire Chronicles. Vampire Chronicles? The Vampire Diaries, sorry. I read some of the Vampire Diaries. I loved the Night World series, and I loved the Secret Circle series, which was a Wicca book. Probably not going to hold up now, and I'm terrified to reread them. But this was a series that I never read, and the first book of the series is called The Strange Power. I think it's called like the Dark Vision series or something. So I was like, I'll read it because it'll be fun. It's one of like my oldest TBR books I've had. It was not good. It was literally like YA fantasy by numbers. The plotline was so tired. All the characters were predictable. There was a predictable love triangle going on. I hated all of the characters. I can't even really remember the plot, except it was a bunch of like telepaths, but like different kinds of telepaths that were all like sent to this institution to get like tested to, I guess, use their powers, probably as like nuclear weapon basically, and this like guy who was basically controlling them. And then I think by the end of it they're kind of escaping, and I don't know what's going to happen next because I'm not carrying it on. It was just bad. It was so boring. It was so tired. This is an old book, don't get me wrong. This book came out in like the 90s or something. I mean, look at that cover. That cover says everything. Also up there for one of my worst book covers of the year, because this is the current cover and this looks nothing like how the main girl looks like. It just looks like the girl from Vampire Diaries. So yeah, a book I really hated. Just bad all round. Nothing good to say about it. It wasn't like offensive, but it was just boring and had brought nothing new to the table. Okay, the next book, taking the number 7 spot, is actually a non-fiction. And it was one of the few books that I read from the non-fiction Goodreads that I thought I was going to love, and I did not. It is Killing the Witches by, I don't know, someone David Riley, I don't know, this guy. So this was a book about the Salem witch trials, or so I thought. I went into this being like, ooh, I'm actually really excited to learn about this, because obviously I love witchcraft and stuff, and I'm like, I wanted to see where the origins of this really famous event, this massacre, basically happened. And only like a third of the book was about the witch trials, and after that it was just the guy stroking his own ego, talking about the American independence, and I just didn't care. It's like, this is not what the book was supposed to be about. I don't know why he chose to just forget what the book was about, like not even halfway through. It was so bad. So that definitely gives it my number 7 spot. At number 6, I'm really sad to put this here because I love this author. I've loved everything else I read by her. Queen Bee wasn't it though. I didn't really have amazing expectations going into this because this is like a prequel for a series that is still ongoing, and we didn't really need to have it, and I'm only holding on to this book in case this does actually become important to the main storyline, because honestly, after reading this, what did this add to the series? Absolutely nothing. Like, I'm hoping there will be something in this that kind of does come back around again and is somewhat important to the lore in Her Majesty's Royal Coven. But I just didn't understand the point of this book at all. See, this could have been good. That's the thing. That's what's annoying. So basically, originally in Her Majesty's Royal Coven lore, which is a modern day witches' coven book about witches who serve the government and that kind of thing in the UK. Originally, it was supposed to have been started by Anne Boleyn. So this book was obviously going to be about Anne Boleyn and about like a secret lover she had in the coven. And I thought it was going to be about her forming the coven. It wasn't. She's already dead by the time the book starts. The coven is already in existence. They are under pressure and in hiding because witch hunters are after them, that kind of thing. But nothing really happened in this book. We got to see a little bit about the relationship between the characters. I couldn't tell any of them apart. The only reason why I think I still rated this like a high 2 or a low 3 is because Juno Dawson's writing is really lovely. And that is why this isn't higher in this list. Like, it's still high enough to be on number 6 in my list because there was no point to this book. But the writing was good, at the very least. This just didn't give me what I was hoping to get from it in the slightest. I didn't understand what the plot had to do with the main series. Didn't care for the characters. We didn't even really see Anne Boleyn that much, just a couple of times in flashbacks because she's already been beheaded at the start of this book. Spoilers for Tudor history, I guess, if you didn't know that. It was bad. It was so bad. I'm really sad about it. Next, yet another book that I was forced to read for the Goodreads challenge that I made myself do. This is all my fault, I know. The Housemaid's Secret by Frida McFadden. Oh, Frida, you write so much, and I feel like I'll probably hate everything you write. So I'd previously read The Housemaid, and whilst I didn't love it, for sure, like it was a low 3, high 2 for me, it at least kept me gripped, and I enjoyed the twist, which I wasn't expecting. Like, for me, that was a book that started off kind of bland and very typical run-of-the-mill domestic drama, and when the twist happened, I really quite liked where it went from there, and I had fun with it. So that wasn't bad. The Housemaid's Secret, however, did the exact opposite in that I was kind of interested in it at the beginning, and then the twist happened, and I hated everything about it from that point. This was just a rehash of the first book. Like, I was hoping we would get something more exciting, something more interesting happening. There was just character assassination for the main girl. I hated her so much throughout the course of this book because she just wasn't communicating. She was making the exact same mistakes that really she should have known better at this point in time. I hated the whole romance storyline that was going on for her, and yeah, I hated the twist so much. I still read it, like, don't get me wrong, it kept me reading it throughout the whole thing. Again, that's why it's not at number 1 position in this list. It wasn't good. And yeah, I refuse to read more Frida McFadden now, basically. She is a do not read author for me. At number 4, we have a cute, cozy, queer fantasy that I feel like everybody loves and I am the only person that hates. This is Can't Spell Treason with T by Rebecca Thorne. I actually got this as an audiobook arc prior to it being mass market published. It was previously kind of independently published, I believe, and then it's had like a really pretty like new releases come out as it's been like traditionally published since then. And this book did not work for me. Again, this was a book that had such promise. I loved the idea of it being a well-established lesbian couple who are basically like escaping their lives in like politics and the royal court to go and just make a cute little tea shop together, and that also like a bookshop. Like, loved the idea of it, hated the execution. For one thing, I didn't like the writing. I couldn't tell the two characters apart at all throughout the book. We switched back and forth between their perspectives, and literally the only things I could tell about them was that like one likes tea and baking maybe, and the other likes books. And the relationship was painfully underdeveloped. Like, these were supposed to be people who were like getting married, and it felt like they didn't know each other, and they kept having the same kind of relationship issues that I expect to see in like someone that's only just getting to know one another. And it was really frustrating because I just was not rooting for them as characters, and I didn't believe in their romance, which is kind of a deal breaker, to be honest. I also hated the plot in this book. Like, some people have said about how this is a book that's supposed to be low stakes, and actually it's got quite high stakes. The plot was such a mess. It was trying to do a bunch of different plot lines, and I didn't really care for any of them apart from like them getting into the small town and making a cafe, making the tea shop work. And that happened like so easily. Like, it was resolved so fast. There was like no conflict with that. They were automatically popular and everyone loved their shop, and I just don't think that's realistic. Like, yes, it's a cozy fantasy, but at least give us something with that. Like, you know, have them be in like, I don't know, like a tea war with somebody else, or have there be issues to them putting this together. And then there was a whole plot line also going on with missing dragon eggs or something, and like the queen was also out to get them because they'd run away, and there was too much going on, and not a single plot line was like well developed or completed in the case of that one book. It just really did not work for me. Like, I love that this really worked well for other people. I wish I'd been one of them, but to me, this book was just so inconsistent and I was not invested. Okay, the final 3 books, and yes, all 3 of these books are fantasy. 2 are romantasy. So it's interesting because, as you'll see when I get to my best books of the year, which will be coming very soon after this video, some of my best books of the year were also romantasy. I was really trying out romantasy this year, and I've worked out that it's a very hit or miss genre for me, I think. And these are some of the worst misses. Number 3, Assistant to the Villain. This was the runner-up for last year's Goodreads new romantasy category, and on paper, yet again, this sounded like something I would have a good time with. This is actually kind of like a parody of, I guess, romantasy, I'm not really sure, but like parody of fantasy, in that we have a main girl who I think is called Evie, I don't remember, but she ends up just like bumping into like the evil villain of the land and ends up working for him as like his secretary. Throughout the course of the book, she has this like massive crush on him that she's trying to pretend is not there, which is really obvious because she's just a klutz and she falls over all the time and has to keep rescuing her, and it's really obvious to everybody. And again, this sounded like it could be fun. Like, I liked the idea of it being like, ooh, the main girl is working for the evil villain and shenanigans. That sounded good to me. But I didn't like it, basically. I really didn't like the main girl. The plot felt very messy and convenient a lot of the time. It was very obvious almost straight away that this evil villain was just not as evil as it was presented to be. And I'm like, if you're doing evil villain, give me evil villain. Like, I want to see this actually, them both be kind of assholes. And that wasn't the case. I liked some of the side characters, I will say, for this one. Like, the whole thing with a frog who can understand people. I liked the healer character, I think, and I did actually thought it was quite funny how one of the other girls that worked there kind of hated her but also kind of respected her. There's a whole mystery, I think, with, God, I can't even remember, certain plots of his has like gone wrong, and so they're trying to work out if there's like a mole within the staff, and I just didn't care. The thing with this book is that it's trying to be really funny, and I did not find it to be funny in the slightest. That's what makes it to be number 3 on this list. I feel like I could say more about it, but I read this so far back now. I think this was like February or March. I really don't remember that much anymore. I just remember it just didn't work for me. Next, at the number 2 spot, and a book I literally only finished like a few days ago Atlas Complex by Olivia Blake. This is the final book in the Atlas series. And oh boy, this went downhill. This went so downhill after the first book, which was so good and so promising. I wasn't surprised going into this that it was bad, because if you've seen the Goodreads rating, yeah. Me and my friend, however, we buddy read the first and second Atlas books together. We both really loved the first book, and the second book didn't quite work. There was something not quite right with the second book. But we were like, well, we'll carry it on. And then we saw the ratings and we were like, let's curb our expectations going into this. But we've already done the first two books. I have a copy of the Atlas Complex. So did she. So we're like, we're gonna finish it. We just gotta. Because we've come this far and I do want to know what happened. This was pointless. This was such a waste of my time, quite honestly. The whole book is just these characters who I once used to love just being pretentious, which, to be fair, they were also pretentious in the first two books, but in a fun way that I liked. And in this book, they're just being pretentious in the fact that they're just talking inside their heads constantly for pages and pages and pages about how they can't trust each other and how maybe they should do a certain thing, but we're not going to do it. We're just going to sit around. And then the plot was so slow as well. Like, it took ages for anything to happen. And then when something finally did happen, I hated it. I hated everything that they did with the plot. There was just character assassination all around. The only characters who I think I still liked by the end of this book were Nico, because that boy does nothing wrong. And I still liked Callum and Tristan, I would say. And I like there was some certain hints about Callum towards the end, but this was just bad overall. So it had been like a good, I don't know, 10 months since I read the second book. Couldn't remember a damn thing. Had to go and check up summaries for it. And then I remembered how messy the place was where we left it. And I was reading this book and I didn't have a fucking clue what was happening. We kept having all these random people show up that weren't the main people, and they were just musing about various things. When we had some reveals, it was so late in that it kind of didn't matter anymore in terms of it actually adding any like real depth to the plot. This just was bad. This just felt long and rambling, and it felt like the author was just kind of wanting to say things and just using her characters as a mouthpiece for it, and forgot that she actually had her plot. I gave this a 1 star, and spoilers, I guess, number 1 spot is also a 1 star. I have only given 2 1 stars this year. I rarely ever give them. This is a 1 star. I did finish it because I'm freaking stubborn and because it was a buddy read and I didn't want to let my friend out. But I really shouldn't have bothered, because this was just disappointing in all ways, and I didn't have a clue what was supposed to be happening in this book. Whatever plot was there, there was so much of the characters just rambling constantly about various things. One thing I did like, and that was a whole text conversation that was happening between two of the characters where they were just flirting and pissing each other off. That was the only redeeming factor of this whole book. I'm very dubious now about reading any more books by Olivia Blake. Like, I did love the Atlas 6 so much, which I will be keeping, but I am getting rid of the second and the third book because they were just bad. And I'm just going to pretend that the first book is all there is, because this was just awful. Here we go. My number 1 worst book of 2024. If you know me, you probably already know what this is. I've already had a big old vent about this in videos. I don't know how coherent I was though. So I'm going to try and give you a proper little rant review for this book, my number 1. It's When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. Oh boy. For anyone that doesn't know what this is about, this was a very popular romantasy that released earlier this year. It was very like TikTok famous, that kind of thing, and I try not to get like bought into that kind of thing, but I was kind of intrigued about this one. Don't get me wrong, the cover is gorgeous and I was very sold on the cover, and I was sold on the fact this was going to be about dragons. Coming off the Fourth Wing hype from last year, which I really loved Fourth Wing, that was in my top 10 books of last year. Still haven't read Iron Flame yet, I know. I was like, this is hopefully going to be my Fourth Wing of this year. It wasn't. This was again a buddy read. Ironically, this was again a buddy read with Jules, who we also read the Atlas series together, so shout out to her for putting up with some really bad books with me this year. Would not have got through them without you. Where do I start with When the Moon Hatched? So this is about a girl whose name I've forgotten, but it probably doesn't really matter because she's not exactly who you think she is anyway. She is, of course, an edgy assassin, and she is living in this city and in this world where basically gods grant people like elemental powers. And if you don't have elemental powers, you're kind of part of this like lower caste system and seen as just like worthless, basically. So she's pretending to be one of those people, but in actual fact she does have powers, and she moonlights as an assassin for this like guild or something. So long story short, she's killing someone one night. She ends up bumping into this like very hot man who sees her and doesn't snitch on her, and she's like, awesome. She ends up then, however, unfortunately getting caught, being taken to jail, and is supposed to be executed, but then Mr. Hot Man comes along and he saves her in a very predictable way. Also, this is another book, much like Priory of the Orange Tree, that I think is criminal because it doesn't have enough dragons. I wanted more dragons from this book. Don't tell me you're giving me a dragon romantasy and barely have dragons in it. The only dragons we had were like a few that were with like the main guy because he had a dragon, and there was like so little screen time given to that, and then some stuff in like flashbacks which are told through these like diary entries that are interspersed through the book, which are basically just big old lore dumps, to be honest, about the world. So this doesn't sound too bad so far, don't get me wrong. Like, she's getting kidnapped by a hot guy, things are gonna work out for her, he obviously really likes her, and to give him his credit, Khan was giving me some green flags through this book. You know, he was fairly kind and considerate to her. He did the whole thing where he's like, I'll cook for you, and it's supposed to be sexy. He's such a big simp for her. He's obviously obsessed with her, and she's just like, but I found you so hot. I hated Rave, that's her name. I've forgotten her name. My hatred just summoned it. So I hated our main character, Rave. And as you know, if I hate the protagonist of a book, that's a book killer for me. I hated her. I feel like the author didn't really know what they wanted to do with her, because they were like, we're going to make her this cold, emotionless woman who has been through so much trauma and can't open her heart. And then we're also supposed to be like, but she cares so much about this person who was killed at the start of the book, and now your whole plotline is going to be getting revenge for that person. And I hated that plotline. It was so bad. It felt like it was just an excuse for our main character to like not get involved in the main narrative at all, and to just ignore Calm because she's like, oh no, but I have to do the revenge thing. And I just didn't believe it, because they made so much of her about being cold, and I didn't believe that she cared so much about this friend of hers that she was like basically willing to devote her whole life to getting revenge. And I really didn't like the romance in this book at all. It felt very like fake and forced. It does this whole thing, which, spoilers, they're basically fated lovers because they once upon a time were together and madly in love, and then tragedy happened and she like lost all her memories. So he's like madly in love with her because she is the person who he once used to love, and their relationship was like obviously like taken away from them, and she doesn't have a clue. So, and spoilers here, I guess. The relationship felt very forced because of that, so I didn't believe in it at all. I didn't believe that Ray felt anything for him other than lust. It just didn't work for me at all in that way. There was also this really worrying event that happened midway through where she kind of gets like taken by this tribe for a while, and it gets very like sexist, and I really hated that whole plot line. Wasn't good. Of course, she had to get rescued as well. Like, she tries to rescue herself, I think, but I feel like he ends up kind of rescuing her. But yeah, this was just a book that really did not work for me in all levels. I just could care less about what happened in this book. There was a twist towards the end that I was like, oh, okay, that could be something interesting for going forward, but I am not moving on with this series. This book was just really, for me, everything I could hate about romantasy. I've said before, this is a really good book too, but that kind of talks about When the Moon Hatched and how this is kind of treading the beats of typical romantasy, but just not doing it in a good or original way. And that's kind of how I felt about it. Like, it just bored me. And to me, that is like one of the cardinal sins of a book. Like, it bored me so much, it just made me angry because I just didn't like anything that was happening. It felt like it was trying to do something that was big and important and complex, and I just didn't care. So yeah, talking about it, it almost feels like this is like not the most offensive book I read this year, but let me tell you, this was like, what, 700 pages of everything I hated. And yeah, I should have DNF'd it, I really should have, but I trucked my way through it. Hated it so much. So that is it, I guess. I hope you got some joy out of the trauma I suffered during this year. I certainly had a lot of fun like venting about them all, to be honest. So my best books of 2024 is going to be coming in the next day or so, where you'll see me in being much more positive and happy, because I did read some really good books in 2024 as well, thankfully. Just some real stinkers in this video. So until next time, stay safe, stay cozy, please read some good books, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!